So if you've been hanging out here long enough, you may have realized that Unitarian Universalists have many understandings of God or the divine. The menu is quite extensive. You've got your theism, your agnosticism, your atheism, you've got pantheism, you've got God, goddess, no God at all, and you've got God or the divine as a metaphor or as an archetype, or God as a stand-in word for the great mystery, the interconnections of the universe that no one can quite totally grasp but knows is there. That's God in the Unitarian Universalist nutshell. And it's all okay under our broad theological umbrella, because God can mean many things. The word God can mean many things. It doesn't have to mean just one thing. Now, many of us who've been raised in what we call the Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, we were taught to believe in a certain kind of God, whether it's the one God or the Trinitarian God. But I think as children, we kind of learned to picture this God as an old white man with a beard. He always has to have a beard, sitting on a throne up in the sky. And even for many of us, who've maybe over time rejected this large and in charge God who pulls all the strings, this God who can intervene anytime in our lives, whenever he feels like it. Even if we don't no longer subscribe to that kind of God, he, and I say he intentionally, he kind of lingers in our consciousness. We hear the word God, and that's where our minds go, zoop, right to the white bearded guy on the throne in the sky. That's kind of funny, isn't it? Although we may have rejected this image of God, we can't get that image out of our heads. So I've found that the word God for many Unitarian Universalists has become a trigger word, because on some level I think we buy into that narrow definition, or don't fully buy into our own redefinitions of the word God strongly enough. And now I want to honor this. Sometimes this happens because of legitimate religious trauma that we've experienced in the past. And then sometimes our aversion to the word God might come because we know there are still people, when they talk about God, that's who they're talking about, right? The old man on the throne in the sky. They're talking about, so many people seem to be talking about God in that traditional narrow definition. And we, as UUs, get a little defensive about that and feel the need to push back. So although Unitarian Universalism might provide refuge from a narrow, particular definition of God for some, it's still really important to remember that there is room for so many concepts of the divine in our faith tradition. Divinity in all of its forms are still on the table. I'd venture to say, too, that in our 7 Unitarian Universalist principles, although they do not mention the word God, they leave plenty of room for the divine. Phrases like the free and independent search for truth and meaning. There's room for God in there. Acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth. There's space for God in there. The right of conscience, space for God. All of these Unitarian Universalist ideals provide healthy space for theistic beliefs or even polytheistic beliefs. Not to mention that our 6 sources of Unitarian Universalism, those sources, those traditions from which we draw include Judaism, Christianity, other world religions, even earth-centered religions that are either theistic or may not be in certain cases. So all of this reminds me of this great story a friend from seminary told me. She had taken a trip to the Philippines, where there are actually several Unitarian Universalist congregations in the Philippines. It's very interesting. But it's probably fair to say that these congregations are a little bit more tied to Christianity, our Christian roots, than most congregations in the U.S. And my friend described going into one of the classrooms or one of the common rooms of the church and seeing a familiar poster listing the 7 UU principles. But someone had written something in at the end. So 7 principles are listed, and then someone wrote in hand, and there's God, and there's God. We need to leave some space for God in all of its many forms. Now, personally, if you want to get really technical about it, I personally can be described as a non-theist. Now, a non-theist means that I don't believe in a personal God that is keeping track of me and intervening in my life. But I also need you to remember that being a non-theist is not the be-all, end-all of my theology. This is just one little part of it. Again, in addition to being a non-theist, I'm lots of other things too, which is also welcome in our world of Unitarian Universalism. Theologically, you don't have to be just one thing. You can be a few different things, and that's perfectly okay. But yet, my personal non-theist view can be described this way. I believe in a mysterious force that connects us all. I don't need to know exactly what that thing is. That thing that I know is there doesn't really even have to be literal. I don't need to talk to this thing or pray to this thing, but that doesn't mean I don't occasionally pray. And this thing doesn't talk to me. It's simply an overall sense of something greater that I feel connected to. And this sense of something greater out there, it allows me to keep the door open to the mystery and the wonder of our existence, right? I mean, our existence based on this long string of kind of miraculous events that have resulted all of us being here in our human form on this earth, in this space right now, or in cyberspace, which is a whole other set of miracles that had to happen for that to be possible. And so I might not pray to this mysterious force, but I am awed by it, and I am humbled by it. And that's a pretty good thing for me. It reminds me that I am not alone out there. I am not just one independent thing. And it also, probably more importantly, reminds me pretty constantly that it's not all about me. I am part of an interdependent web. So there's a progressive Christian blogger out there named Teresa Blythe, and she distinguishes, she has a way of distinguishing most non-theists from theists. She says, like me, non-theists do not believe in a personal God. She says, like me, non-theists may believe in a cosmic force, spirit, or intelligence, but they may not call on this force for specific help in their life. She says that plenty of Christians describe themselves as non-theists. That blew my mind a little. But in her liberal United Church of Christ tradition, our cousins on our Unitarian side, she says there are a great many who follow the teachings of Jesus while stressing that while they believe in God, they do not believe in the personhood of God. She also writes that there are many Jews who understand God more as a life force than kind of this personified, human-like, but omnipotent entity. So apparently, we UUs do not have the market cornered when it comes to understanding God in many different ways. There's a lot of variety out there. But yet, if we want to go through the purely intellectual exercise of sorting atheists from non-theists from the theists, because we love our intellectual exercises, one might say that an atheist lacks belief in gods or supernatural beings. A non-theist may believe in something akin to a higher power, but no personal God. And of course, a theist typically believes in at least one personal God, or polytheist, many personal gods. And honestly, the distinction between these three categories can get really blurry and fuzzy, and they don't even begin to describe all of what's out there in terms of belief and divinity. So, although we enjoy intellectual exercises, we should not get hung up on this, because all of these perspectives are valid. And we, as Unitarian Universalists, we don't come together on that stuff, right? We come together on other things. We come together on our values, our principles, and our covenants that dictate how we will be with one another. We don't come together based on our personal God, no God, many gods, maybe a God theologies. It's just not how we're organized. So the takeaway here is not to get too wrapped up in any of this, as interesting as it may be. We don't have to box anybody into a particular category of theistic or atheistic or non-theistic belief. But it's so good to be aware of just all the variety that's out there. And for us, to continually just make space and respect this whole continuum of belief in the divine. Because personally, I find it fascinating, and I always find something to learn, whether or not I particularly agree with what I'm learning about. So there are so many ideas about God and gods out there. You know, I could write a lifetime of sermons on the various concepts of God. You know, it would take a lifetime to cover all of those bases. But when we use the word God in our context right here, in the UU context, God can stand for just about any of these ideas. Not only may this God, if we say God here, this God may be impersonal. It doesn't have to be literal. It can stand in for the God that you are comfortable with. There's a poem out there that says, God lives in hope and in memory and in moments of realization, in smiles of children, in nature, in contradiction. God is what you see and hear. God is part of you. So from that poem, how much do you think is literal and how much is metaphor? I don't know. And does it even matter? Perhaps like beauty, God is in the eye of the beholder. Years before I became a minister, I took a seminar led by the Reverend Dr. Galen Gingrich, who's the senior minister at All Souls Unitarian Church, located on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. As you can imagine, that's a pretty big church, and he's a pretty famous guy in the UU minister world. At this seminar, I sat next to another UU named Ted, who happened to be a very nice man and also a retired engineer. He was also a professed atheist, not shy about that at all. You don't have to be as UU. But yet somehow he was intrigued enough to attend a seminar voluntarily that was called Theology in a Secular Society. At some point in this 2-day, 6-hour seminar held at GA in the capital of Utah, Ted had quite unexpectedly had what one might call a conversion experience. He turned to me and exclaimed, in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way, "I found God in Salt Lake City." Probably not the way most people find God in Salt Lake City. Apparently, Galen Gingrich's, the seminar leader, his definition of God was expansive enough and non-supernatural enough that this atheist and scientific thinker like Ted could get totally on board with God without compromising his own belief system. This seminar that so affected Ted actually became a book that Galen Gingrich published a few years later. It's called God Revised: How Religion Must Evolve in a Scientific Age. Now that probably gives you a clue why Ted was so excited. In this book, Gingrich writes, "I agree with the atheists that God is not supernatural, yet I agree with the advocates of traditional religion that belief in God is necessary." In explaining this obvious contradiction, he says, "I'm trying to revise our concept of God by basically saying that just because God isn't a guy in the sky doesn't mean the experience of God does not exist. I speak of our experience of being connected to the people around us, to the world, to the universe, to everything that is present, as well as everything that is past and everything that is possible. That experience is what I mean when I use the word God, and I think God is the right name for it." That's the end quote. God is an experience. So much for the old guy on the throne. This is Galen Gingrich's definition of God. God is our experience of connection to everyone and everything that existed in the past, exists now, and may exist in the future. That is God. God is an experience of connection. God is an experience of connection. He goes on to say that there is no full-blown experience of God all at once because the universe is a big place. The past is enormously long and the future is completely wide open. But I think there are moments when we walk under the night sky or by the beach or the mountains, when we sit and worship, that we get a clear sense of being part of all this. God's picture is not painted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, but God is like beauty in that God is an experience of transcendence. So God is an experience of transcendence. So we have to unpack what transcendence means. Transcendence means existence or experience beyond the normal physical level. So what he's saying is God is experience. God is an experience beyond the normal or physical level. That's the transcendent part. In simpler terms, God is an experience of something greater. And isn't that why we do strange things like becoming Unitarian Universalists and participating in congregational life, to connect our lives to other lives, to connect greater to all of existence? I think not because we read Galen's book, but because we intuitively know, right? We intuitively know that our existence is mysterious and awe-inspiring. And even science hasn't quite figured it all out just yet. So I have to admit that my personal theology that I told you about was influenced by Galen Gingrich, because I took that seminar many years ago, but just as much, probably even more so, it was influenced by my own personal feelings, my own personal intuition. Galen Gingrich just gave me words to express it, right? He put some words to what I was already thinking and feeling, as I feel like many Unitarian Universalists do as well. I was intuiting something greater through the experience of connection and through the experience of transcendence. And this is a real phenomenon for many of us. I am simply just one of the very many. So one of my greatest hopes is that God and other religious trigger words for some Unitarian Universalists will cease to be trigger words. Banning certain words, religious words, from our supposedly open-minded and pluralistic religion, I think is a little bit like book burning, right? Just because something makes some people uncomfortable doesn't mean that it isn't useful for others and that it should be banished. I think what we really need to do is work on healing the trauma associated with those words, work on redefining and reclaiming, taking back those words that might have been used in ugly ways, taking them back, because most of the time those meanings were just hijacked in the first place. And I think that's a much more healthy process rather than sweeping all those, those words we don't like under the carpet. I think we all know that sweeping stuff under the carpet is not a healthy and emotional response to just about anything, right? Then sometimes we might say, well, if God could mean so many different things, it doesn't mean anything at all, and why should we use this archaic word that doesn't have any one particular meaning? Well, Galen has an answer for that. He says that I believe that the word God and the symbol of the supernatural power and infallible source of revelation that it represents is the single most powerful force in this struggle between fundamentalism and pluralism. And I am simply unwilling to let the opposition have full access to a symbol of that kind. If we cede to them the word God and basically say God is what you say God is, we simply think that's wrong. We have ceded the battle as far as I'm concerned. We can walk away from God. We can walk away from calling ourselves a religion. What are we leaving on the table, right, for all of those who need us, who need our religious context for health and wholeness? In response to those whose wounds are opened by words like God, Galen says that the goal should be to help heal those wounds and not simply to avoid or deny the wounds by not naming them, end quote. So my wish for you all, my merry band of seekers, questioners, agnostics, theists, non-theists, atheists, pantheists, panentheists, deists, and more, Jason Post, shout out, is that you give yourselves time to reflect on those religious words, especially the ones that make you a little squirmy or a little uncomfortable, as well as religious ideas and practices that also have the same effect. There is some really good work to be done in those places. Do everything you can to vanquish that word or idea or practice that you feel uncomfortable with. You can reclaim it and you can redefine it until it has no power over you. That's when the healing has happened. And I think it's also important to be generous to others regarding the words and the ideas and the practices, because different words, ideas, and practices, they resonate in so many different ways for so many different people, and we should not be able to legislate people out of the words, ideas, and practices that work for them. We are a religion that's all about finding commonalities among differences. And this isn't always easy work, but it really is. In our pluralistic religious tradition, it's the work we are called to do. So ultimately, no matter what words we use, we're all here for similar reasons. To make meaning together, right? To make meaning out of this outrageous odyssey called life, and to make sense of all its moments, from the mundane to the joyful to the sorrowful, as well as those moments of transcendence. So let's support each other in this really kind of complicated undertaking of being a human being. Being human is a really tough job, but it's a joyful job that we can share together. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.